Negotiation is an everyday part of life, whether it's a one-on-one interaction with your spouse or a heated discussion between board members. Mastering the art of negotiation can be a valuable tool. Joining us in studio now is Jessica Hubbard, journalist at Finweek. I also have Mark Ashton at the desk, Douglas Kruger, professional speaker and author, and Professor Raymond Suttner from Rhodes University and UNISA. Everyone, thank you again. Welcome to the desk. Raymond, let me come to you first. Yes. What are the key lessons that we can learn from the Mandela era of diplomacy that are applicable to the business and in particular to corporate life?
Well, I would say sometimes one doesn't have to negotiate. If you're sufficiently powerful and the party with whom one is dealing is sufficiently weak, you can dictate terms. And you need certain conditions to be present before negotiations become possible. So once all the relevant parties realize that they are not going to be able to achieve their own goals on their own, even if they want to, they have to negotiate with the other side. And Mandela started actually in prison. Started negotiating. I was also in prison as a political prisoner, and it's an illusion to think that prisoners are powerless. Prisoners have a capacity to cause drama, and it embarrasses them to have this bombardment of letters, which Mandela and others would be doing. So he was able, even from prison, to start negotiating. And I think the lessons that later emerged is the intelligence services on the side of the previous apartheid government recognized that there had to be a political solution, that you could not subdue the population through violence on a permanent basis. Consequently, they advised the government to meet with Mandela and to sit down and work on a long-term political solution. Now, on both the side of the ANC and the government, neither side could expect to achieve their goals unmodified in a negotiated situation.
Of course, we're talking about phenomenal individuals when we go back to that era in South African history. But perhaps let's fast forward and Doug, maybe to come to you and look at what skills do good negotiators have? And this obviously would be applicable across sectors. But what is it that you've got to have to make sure that you can actually get your way out of the situation?
Well, the very first thing is that you have to actually represent your own interests. And the interesting thing is that most working class families are not taught to do that. In Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell gives a fantastic example. He talks about a trip to the dentist and perceptions of authority. And he says your working class families will tend to teach their children that the dentist is the authority and to be feared and obeyed. And the opposite applies to wealthier families who teach their child that the dentist is a resource. Now, already that perception changes people's life paths. You've got one set of people who say, well, we must be cogs in a system, be quiet, be obedient, and another group of people, almost another species, who represent their own interests and are taught from the word go to do so. So that's the starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I can probably use a personal story there. I remember in Standard 6, we were voting for student representative councils, and it ended up coming to a situation where myself and one other person were involved in we ended up being in a tie for it. And I'd always been taught you never vote for yourself in it.
Well.
And I was, I always kind of laugh back and say, would my life have been different if I'd represented on the SRC? And I ended up losing by the single vote. The vote that didn't come through was my own. So I think that it's very interesting to you actually have to stand if you're going to go into a negotiation, you have to have some principles around which to work. And you've got to stand for that and represent it. I think one thing that's very interesting. I went to listen to Yanni Mouton speak at the PSG AGM about 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the questions that comes up with PSG over and over again is this question of corporate governance, because often they've got King 3 and all of this other regulations. And one of the shareholders asked, what about this from a corporate governance perspective? Because essentially what happens in PSG is what Yanni Mouton decides is going to happen in PSG. And his answer was, so long as I'm making money and I've got a set of principles that I live to, you guys can either elect to be with me or you can be against me. And he's got that position from which to negotiate.
Right.
Just to add in, I thought it was a great quote from the article. Mandy wrote that in business as in life, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And I think people, especially younger graduates coming out of their studies or coming out of newer jobs, they don't realize that they actually are in a position to negotiate, and they don't have the confidence to ask for what they want. So I think that's key as people move into the business world.
I think the way we've also introed our discussions talking about negotiating and getting what you want out of it, I want to take a step back and, Raymond, ask you the question whether negotiation is always about winning. Is the outcome, should the outcome always be about winning? And if that's the mindset you walk in with, are you already perhaps losing sight of what negotiation is about?
Let's just see if we understand, have the same considerations. You see, when you enter into negotiations, no matter how much of a star you are as an individual, if you don't have a constituency behind you, you can't achieve things. So I don't agree that workers are necessarily differential. It depends whether they're organized. Now, at the moment, the government doesn't have to listen to some communities in Bromfisherville because they are not an organized community. Now, if you are an organized community and you have a person representing you, once you enter into the negotiating terrain, you have to accept that you will not achieve everything that you would like. Mandela used to say to us informally, the apartheid regime is not on its knees begging for peace. Now, on that basis, he recognized that it was necessary that you had to give something to the other side in order to achieve a consensus where both sides felt that peace was better than war, and that was not. Maybe we would have wanted Nuremberg trials or things like that, but that was not possible. You have to have a sense of what is possible. It's not just that wanting to win is undesirable, it's just that winning totally may not be possible.
I think oftentimes when we talk about negotiating, we always think forward-looking and thinking about either sealing a deal or getting a transaction through. But Doug, what about when you're trying to negotiate yourself out of something, whether it's a partnership or some sort of deal? Are there rules of engagement that one should pick up on in that particular situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the business world, one of the hardest ones to do is that the attrition of your low-end, high-input clients. And it's generally a good principle to focus on the easy, high-end clients, the ones that bring in the bulk of your revenue and take the least of your time and your effort. And whenever I speak for audiences, I always say, who are your hardest customers? And the consensus is always the ones who pay the least demand the most.
Right.
So one of the hardest things to negotiate your way out of is an existing relationship. And in fact, one of the ways, practically speaking, to do that is to actually announce publicly that you are elevating your positioning in whatever industry you're involved in and pass that work on to the next level down. And what you're essentially doing is you're not divorcing your customer and saying, I won't work for you anymore. You're saying, I've moved on to the next level. Let this person assist you with the level that you need.
I think that throws a very important point as well. And maybe, Mark, you can give us some input on this. The post the deal. So you've negotiated yourself either in or out of a particular partnership. Do you think that within the corporate workspace, people actually pay attention to the relationship after the negotiation?
Look, I think, I find it very interesting. When you exist inside a corporate, there's often there's cliques, there's little power cliques, and they're forever changing. And I think that when you find people that are within business are able to hitch their wagon to whoever the star is, and they're quite good at maneuvering through the ranks. And I think it's a skill that you actually should acquire. I think that I think that we still do it very poorly in South Africa in a lot of cases, is we don't maintain our client relationships. And I think we spoke about the switching economy a couple of weeks back. The idea is we still don't look after our relationships as well as we should.
Yeah. Raymond, perhaps let me come to you with this. I mean, I would think that in order for negotiation to be even on the table, you have to have a corporate culture that actually allows it. From your lifelong experience, how do you think corporates should balance creating a space to negotiate as against making sure that the set boundaries are not called into question by every single individual in the firm?
You see, I don't think a corporate culture is established in the beginning, particularly in political situations. And I think it's the same in business. if you're dealing with very weak customers or weak constituency, the temptation is to really move from A to B without any sense of negotiations. So that I think people have to recognize that when you do something in business and you don't take into account the wishes of the other person, the long term, you've got to have the long view. Whether in politics, in business, in sport, whatever it is, you've got to understand that a victory at one point might be a defeat at another point.
Yeah.
And you've got to try to incorporate the interests of the other side. Now, that is not a culture that people come with automatically. They actually have to be convinced that a knockout blow maybe seems like a victory, but it's
Don't
not.
punch too hard. Just don't knock them out, but give them a good batting, hey?
Sure.
Maybe a question I want to throw at Doug. The role of technology in negotiations these days, and I think it's a skill that we were just chatting Toastmasters before we came on the air. The ability to actually talk to somebody seems to have disappeared in a lot of corporates. And we see email is just thrown around left, right, and centre, and it's easy. Every time you don't get your way, you just add an extra person to the email, to the CC line, because this will make it more, give you a bit more gravitas, just to say, well, I've got a little bit more clout than you have. And it's become very non-verbal technology, social media, etc. seems to be a tool that a lot of people hide behind. And you know, we go all the way down to bullying in school level. Non-verbal technology and an anonymous type technology makes it very easy to push an agenda across.
Absolutely.
Have we lost that ability to actually just talk face to face with people?
Mark, the simple answer is yes. And the more complicated answer is we should be positioning ourselves in a higher level in our industry. When you are seen as iconic, the deals start coming to you, the people start coming to you, you don't have to knock on doors. So persuasion becomes inherently easier when you are iconic.
Yeah.
Now what we tend to do is, as you say, we rob ourselves of that effectiveness using technology. I saw a presentation given out in the Free State a little while ago, where the person doing what was supposed to be a thought leadership presentation was so hampered by their use of PowerPoint that it killed their effectiveness. He didn't get the audience he was expecting on the day, but what he did do was he stuck to his canned presentation.
Right.
Now, PowerPoint is not inherently evil in the same way that guns and timeshare salesmen are not inherently evil. It's how they're unleashed on society.
Sure.
But what tends to happen is it has a stop-start feel to it. And of course, if you don't know how to use it well, people tend to turn their back on the audience, not engage, and it robs you of the very heart and soul of what public speaking is. It's that human connection, it's that magic, and that's where the persuasion lies. If it weren't the case, we would be doing all of our conferences around the world on Skype today, and it hasn't happened.
Sure.
There are still hundreds of thousands of rands and dollars spent on flying people around the world to talk to people one-on-one and to talk to audiences, and just shows how powerful it is.
But just on the flip side of that, the article did point out how we can use social media as a research tool and to aid the negotiations and to aid the communications process, which I think people need to pay attention to. And instead of using it as something to hide behind, use it as a tool to get to know who you're speaking to better, just to get some more context around your meeting.
And again, I just want to check this back to Doug quickly. I mean, salary negotiations are a very good example. So, a lot of organizations use these automated HR systems which effectively give you scores. You hardly have to give any feedback to somebody. And when you're in a salary negotiation, the employer, in theory, holds all the power. How do you approach a situation like that where you can empower yourself as the employee to actually communicate that you got value?
And it's such a mindset shift, and it's a difficult one for most people to do, because the kind of thinking and work advice that's handed down from generation to generation, if you look at it, essentially started with the Industrial Revolution. And the core belief is be a quiet, functional cog in a system. Do not make waves. And it is the opposite of the kind of belief system that we need to get ahead in the corporate world, or indeed in any career. We need to be the wave makers, the voices, the splash, the noise. And yes, the starting point to that is to represent yourself and change your psychology.
And perhaps let's turn the wave and the splash on its head, Raymond, and come to you and ask you the question, when is it a bad idea to negotiate? When do you know that maybe this one is, I should just take it as is and walk away from it?
If it's clear that the other party is in bad faith and actually not seeking a resolution of the problems that have brought you together. The problem, it needn't be a problem, can also be a prospect. You may have made contact with someone through the social media, and then you have an idea that there's an affinity between you. But when you actually sit down and talk, you have an idea that when you both say we want to achieve X, in fact the other person has something in mind which is antagonistic to your interests. Once you see that, that's where intuition is important. You may pick it up with your intuition, and I would not ignore intuition. There's science, but I think intuition is very important. And if you have a sense that this is actually a fruitless thing, don't draw it out too long.
And on